Hey everyone, Jen here, and today I'm going to walk you through building a water profile for my double IPA that I will be brewing in a couple of days. So the first thing is I like to use Bru'n Water for my water profiles to build them. There are other options if you have Beersmith, there's a water building option in there. You can also use water building on Brewer's Friend. I learned on Bru'n Water before the water feature was actually available in Beersmith, so it's the one that I like to use. It's free. It's available at the Bru'n Water website, where there's a cool picture of a baseball player hitting a glass of beer out of the park. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is I'm on tab 1. This is my water report input. Now for this beer, I'm going to be using distilled water. So distilled water means it's going to be completely naked. There's not going to be any kind of minerals or anything in it. So that makes this part really pretty easy. I'm not going to need to fill in any of these concentrations that I would for, say, if I was using my municipal water source. And I can do another video teaching you how to look at that water report and input that into this tab on Bru'n Water. So as we're going through, we don't really need to add anything here, but you can see it's got all of this information for you. And one thing to note when we're using something like distilled water is that it's not going to be a completely neutral 7 on our pH range. It's usually going to be around 6.3 or 6.5. You can look that up for the specific brand of water you're using. I usually just buy store brand distilled water by the gallon. Again, there's a more precise way you can do that. If you have a pH meter, you can read the actual pH of what your distilled water is. For me, it's not, I'm not that precise in terms of building my water report. And I don't think it makes that big of a difference. And also your water pH isn't nearly as important as your mash pH. So let's go to this next page. This is our Sparge Acidification. So for me, you can see I've got my starting water pH right here. I'm going to change this to 6.5 just as a as kind of as a placeholder. Like I just said, your water pH isn't as important as your mash pH. And one of the things that I really like about Bru'n Water, you can see here that he has these little reminders that pop up to tell you where you can find this information. And he recommends entering 8 as a good estimate of a typical water pH. We know that distilled water is going to be a little bit less than 7. It's going to be a little more acidic. It's not going to be a completely neutral 7. So for myself, when I'm acidifying my water, I use lactic acid at 88% strength. So this is already put in here. This is usually, I just keep it that way. I have done other kinds of acid to acidify my mash, but most of the time I just have lactic acid on hand, and that's what's in that box. So next we're going to go to our grain bill input. And this is where we're putting in the grist of everything that's going to be in the mash. So for this recipe, my grist is really pretty simple. It's just going to be Maris Otter and honey malt. Later on in my brew day, I'm going to be adding dextrose, but since that is not going into my mash, I'm not going to include that here, but it is included on my recipe as a fermentable. So I have my recipe printed out, but I'll just show you quickly. This is my double IPA 6.0 recipe. This is what it looks like. So you can see here is where I'm getting my fermentables from, is right down here at the very bottom. So I'm going to take that information and I'm going to go over here in grains. And the first thing I'm going to type in is Maris Otter. And that's going to be my base malt. So I'm going to have 13 pounds, 7.8 ounces. And my SRM is going to be about 4. Then I'm going to put in my honey malt. This is going to be a crystal. So you can see you've got base, crystal, roast, and acid. All of your grains are more than likely going to fit in here in one of these categories. So this is going to be a crystal malt. For this, I'm using 0 pounds and 2.4 ounces. And my color is going to be 25. So that's it for this. These are the only grains I'm using in this recipe. So it's pretty basic, and it's going to be a really good starting point for building our water from the ground up. So this next tab is going to be our water adjustment, and this is where the magic happens, right? So looking at this page, the first thing I'm going to do is come over here to our total batch volume. For me, this is going to be 5.5. I'm doing brew in a bag, so I don't have a sparge. I'm putting all of the water I need for my mash into the mash with no sparge. So then I'm looking at my recipe from Beersmith tells me that I need 8.75 gallons of water to make this 5.5 gallon batch. So if I was doing a sparge, this might be something like maybe I only need, let's say 4 gallons, or we'll say probably like 6 gallons here and like 2.5 gallons here, right? So as I'm doing my adjustments over here, I'll just put in a number here so you can see how that changes. You can see that it will add what your total addition should be in your mash, and then what addition you should be adding to your sparge. But like I said, I'm doing brew in a bag, so there's no sparge. So I'm going to make this 0 again, and I'm going to make this 8.75. And that 8.75 volume is something that Beersmith calculates for me to tell me how much total water I'm going to need. So that's where that information is coming from. So then the next thing I want to do is come up here to our water profile adjustment calculator. So you can see right now my diluted water profile right here. This is going to give me everything that's in my water, which is 0, right? I don't have any minerals because I'm using distilled water. So then right now I have pale ale chosen as my water profile, and that's going to give me what my target is going to be, what I'm aiming for this. So if you click on this, I'm going to move this guy out of the way. If you click on this, you can see that there are several different water profiles you can choose from. And there are some, like Burton is in here. Even though I'm doing a double IPA, I don't like Burtonized water. It's just something that I don't typically prefer even for a double IPA. It's a very specific water profile. So for this one, I'm just scrolling back down to get to my pale ale. And from here, I can really build it on my own. So like I said, I'm going to choose this pale ale profile. And now I'm going to start to figure out 2 things. One, I want to get, you see my estimated mash pH. We'll see this turn green as I'm adding more minerals into the water, which means that it's getting into the range, the proper range for pH. And this comes from the grain bill input that we did here. So that's why tab number 3 is really important to do, because that's where we're going to get what our estimated mash pH is going to be. So I've chosen pale ale profile, and I'm going to come down here. And like I said, you can see right now we don't have anything in here. And really, when we're building a water profile, it's going to be a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I like using distilled water for this purpose, because just as a brewer, somebody who's interested in, figuring out every little thing about what's going into my beer, using distilled water is a really great way to do that, because you have to really think about why you're adding things, and if you're achieving your profile in the most accurate and efficient way possible. So when I'm looking up here at this targeted finished water, this is a good guide. That's not necessarily what my finished profile will look like, but it is a good enough guide. So one thing I will note, when you are brewing with your brewing water, for most beer styles, you're generally going to want your calcium to be a minimum of 50 parts per million. That's going to be the same for your sulfate and your chloride. Now, for this one, you can see that our sulfate to chloride ratio looks like it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. I'm going to do about a 2.5-to-1 ratio between my sulfate and my chloride, because I'm making a double IPA. This is going to be a classic West Coast IPA, so I want it to have that bitterness really pop from the elevated sulfate, as well as having a drier finish. If I'm doing something like a New England IPA where I'm looking for a rounder, softer mouthfeel, I would flip that ratio to have it be 2 parts calcium chloride to 1 part sulfate. And this is just based on personal preference. You don't really want more than 500 parts per million of sulfate. That's going to be if you're Burtonizing your water. So you're going to be looking for that Burton snatch. That's a lot of sulfate to put into a beer. So for me, I generally like to do about a 2-to-1 or 2.5-to-1. And both of these, when we're adding sulfate and chloride, we're also adding calcium. So again, going back here, I want my calcium to be at least 50 parts per million, but I can see here with my targeted finished water adjustment, I'm going to want that calcium to be a little bit higher and a little bit higher than the minimum. And so what I'm going to be looking to do, since I'm looking to add more sulfate than chloride, is I'm probably going to add the majority of my calcium and my sulfate in the form of gypsum. Right down here, you can see the minerals that you can use for to treat your water. I would say, really like chalk, pickling lime, pretend those don't exist. Pickling lime can be dangerous to work with. Chalk is super, super hard to get to dissolve in water. So although you can use both of those as a calcium adjustment, I don't think they're necessary. You can do most of your adjustments using gypsum and calcium chloride in order to get more calcium into your water profile. So again, this is the way I know how to do it. It's probably not going to be the most efficient way. And if somebody out there can figure this out like on the first shot, I think that's great for you. This is how I do it to figure it out. So it's a little like cobbled together. But what I'm going to do with gypsum, because I know that's going to be the mineral that I want to use the most of, so I'm just going to go over here to the grams per gallon and hit 1 and see what that's going to do. So that's going to do a few things for me. For one, you see that calcium addition has helped lower my pH to where it's in a good range. For most brewing, like a 5.3 to 5.5 is going to be a good pH. There may be different estimated mash pHs depending on the style. And most of the time, if you're looking at a recipe or something like that, it's going to tell you if this pH needs to be outside of that 5.3 to 5.5 range. So what I see here is this is going to give me 62 parts per million of calcium, and it's going to give me 147 parts per million of sulfate. So what I might want to do here then is see what the 1.5 is going to do. So you can see here, what I'm really trying to do is get this sulfate level a little bit closer to that 300, because I'm probably not going to add too much calcium here. So let's go 1.55 and see what that does for us. And then with our calcium chloride, I'm going to add just a little bit because I want to keep that sulfate and chloride ratio about, like I said, like a 2.5 to 1. This is not precise. This is just something that I aim to do that. I want more calcium than I want chloride, but I still want the minimum amount of chloride that I need in my beer. So I can see if I add 0.45 calcium chloride, I'm getting very, very close with my calcium. And I've gone a little bit over on my chloride. So I might go back down here and adjust it just to see what that does. Because like I said, I'm looking for that 2.5 to 1 ratio between my sulfate and my chloride. So this is a little bit closer. It's still a little bit high for me. So let's go down to 0.3. So see, that kind of bumped it down a little bit too much. So let's try 0.35 and see where we are. So that's going to give me about what I'm looking for. And then the next thing I want to do with other things such as magnesium, and this is also, again, one of the things I really like about Bru'n Water, if you hover over this, it will tell you about what you want for each one of these. And so we see here, it also has this note that says add magnesium when its bitter and sour taste is desirable in beer, such as bitter or pale ales. So there's no need to add magnesium unless you want to, but I am going to add a little bit of magnesium in the form of Epsom salt. So just like the salts that you buy at the grocery store to soak your feet in. So I'm going to add in 0.7 here of our Epsom salt. So that's going to be adding, you can see, magnesium and sulfate to the beer. So my target here for magnesium is 18. And if I add that 0.7, that gives me 18 exactly. That also gives my sulfate ratio right here to 301. So I'm doing pretty well on this. I might want to add just a little bit of sodium. Again, if you go up here and hover over this, it will tell you how, just kind of general guidelines. Obviously, if you're making something like a gosa, you would have more salt. But for this, I'm just going to add just a little bit of salt just to kind of round out the mouthfeel. And this canning salt, this is table salt. So you see here, I might not actually do this much because once I add the 0.25, I can see here that gets my sodium pretty well, but that does kick my chloride up a little bit more. However, I am going for a 2-to-1 ratio. So 300 parts per million to 100 parts per million is going to be about what I'm looking for. I do want a little more calcium here. As you can see, I want about 140. I'm at 129. So what I might do here is take this. Actually, I will go up here to our gypsum and let's see what 1.6 does for me. So 1.6 is going to get me pretty close. I think we can get a little bit closer. Let's do 1.65. So this is going to give me 135 is my estimated parts per million for calcium, 18 for magnesium, which is about where I want to be, 26 for sodium. Sulfate is 315. It's a little high, but since I'm making a double IPA, I don't mind if it's going to be a little bit higher than this 300 parts per million. And then my chloride is going to be a little bit high as well, but in the overall beer, this is going to be about an 8.5% beer. I think that that's going to, that ratio is going to add to more of a complex mouthfeel and overall flavor profile. So I'm okay with that being a little high, and I might just add a little bit more to see if I can't bump up to that 140 that I'm looking for. So if we do this, I think this is going to be my finished profile. You can see my estimated mash pH is 5.3 and 5.29, but 5.3 rounding up. So that's where I want my pH. Then when I go here and I look at what kind of my target is versus what my mashing profile is going to be once I add these minerals to my mash water, I'm going to see I want about 140. I'm at 141, 18, 18, 25, 26, 300, 330 is a little high, but that's okay. 55, 99 is a little high. That's okay. I'm not worrying about bicarbonate because I don't need to acidify my mash at all. The grains that I'm using as well as the minerals is doing that for me. And I can see that right here where it says 5.29. So if I were also going to acidify my beer, I might use lactic acid. I don't need to do that here because my pH is right where I want it. So I would add the lactic acid if I needed to increase the acidity in my beer, increase the acidity being lowering my mash pH. I don't need to do that here, so I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to double check. I've got my total mash volume, and like I said, this is brew in a bag, so I'm not going to be doing a sparge. And then my total batch volume, I'm going for 5.5 gallons at the end of my brew day when I'm knocking out and I'm going from the kettle into my fermenter. I'm going to hope that I have 5.5 gallons. So then I go down here to the adjustment summary, and you can see I've got this really nice water report that I can print out. This is going to tell me exactly how much of each one of these additions I'm going to put into my mash water. So I'm going to do 15.3 grams of gypsum, 3.1 grams of calcium chloride, 6.1 grams of magnesium chloride, and 2.2 grams of sodium. So canning salt, so that's just table salt. I use Morton's kosher salt for mine. And then with this, I'm going to be all finished with my water. So I'm going to print this out, and then I will do another video showing you how to measure these out. The last thing that I will say about using Bru'n Water is this water adjustment. If you're curious, when you go up here and you've got the pale ale, you've got all of these different profiles, and you're wondering, well, what do these profiles mean? You can scroll down to the bottom here, and you have got this really cool water profiles. These are all going to be in when you do the drop down. So let's say you're not sure what kind of water profile you're looking for, or you're not sure what each one of these water profiles is going to look like. You can just scroll down here to the bottom, and it will give you all of that information. And all of these, as it says here, are user customizable. I have one in here that is I believe I have it is my, oh, I don't see it. I do have one that is a New England IPA profile that I built myself and added to this. So that's also one of the cool things about Bru'n Water is you can create your own water profiles and add them down here. So when you come up here to choose your desired water profile, if you've added a custom profile, you'll be able to find that in here. And I think that's a really cool thing. And then the very, very last thing that I will say about Bru'n Water, one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of it is that it's got this water knowledge tab. And this is written by Martin Brungard. He's a really great, well-known home brewer, and I think he just does a fantastic job of explaining water knowledge in a very easily to understand, very succinct way. And this is, all of the same information you're going to see someplace like in the Water Book by John Palmer. Is just a little more approachable and gives you more of the basics without getting way, way too complicated, which I think sometimes the Water Book can do. So that is how I'm building this water profile using distilled water for my double IPA recipe. I'm going to print out this recipe and use that to get my minerals ready for my brew day. So thank you for watching, and I will do a couple of other water profiles just to show you how to use Bru'n Water. I think building your own water profile, particularly from distilled water, like I said, is a really, really great tool to really understand and think and be deliberate about what kind of beer you're making. And I will also do one that shows you with a water report how to input that in and then how you can adjust up or down based on what your existing water is if you're not using distilled water. So thank you for watching. And as always, if you have questions, you can comment below. You can also reach out to me at Under the Genfluence on social media with any questions that you have. So thanks for watching. And next up, we will do our actually measuring out the minerals.